It was just a ride. That's all. We stuck out our thumbs and hoped for some kindly soul or some disinterested and bored driver to pick us up. Hitchhiking was a thing back in a time when Uber was just a twinkle in the 21st century's eye. It was a way to get around, no questions asked. Hopefully. You see, there was a whole thing about hitchhikers getting abducted, assaulted, and much, much worse. It was the worry of all parents of the younger generation who insisted on rolling the dice, trying their luck, and hoping that they'd win or come out safely on the other side. Stranger danger? It didn't exist. Hitchhiking seems so unbelievably dangerous and downright irresponsible now. Looking through the lens of the 21st century, the dangers of getting into a vehicle of a total stranger seem obvious. Yet, hitching a ride from some random person was the norm, not the exception, for a good couple of decades during the 1960s and 1970s, and even part of the 1980s. And yes, I get it. Uber is the same thing, you might say, but it isn't. Getting a ride from some unknown stranger via the incredible power of an outstretched thumb and nothing else is a thing unto itself, and thankfully a thing that for the most part remains in the past. Remember, GPS didn't exist back then. Heck, neither did Google, the internet, or anything remotely similar to what we're used to now. Once you got into that vehicle, it was anyone's guess where you'd end up. Hopefully, wherever it was, you'd arrive in one piece, alive. Today, book an Uber for your teenage daughter and request to track the pickup home with each street, turn, and stoplight that the car encounters shown to you via your phone in real time. That's what we're used to. Then, your teen went out, and parents everywhere prayed that they'd refrain from hitchhiking, fat chance, and that they'd return home safe and sound. But how much of the scary hitchhiking lore was real? Was it really the most unsafe thing that young people could do in an era of analog and nothing else? If you ask a random adult who was a parent during that time period, hitchhikers, especially young female ones, were abducted on the regular. Proof not required. Trust the adults who knew. Yes, of course there were tales of hitchhiking nightmares. Women, mostly, abducted, never to be seen again. Weirdos living out their sick fantasies on some poor, unwitting young soul just looking for a ride from A to B and receiving much worse. Again, how much of the lurid tales of this time period were real and how much was hyperbole? We'll never really know, I guess. What we do know is that the craze that held its own for a good couple of decades or more died a quiet and uneventful death just as a new and more connected era was born. But trends are cyclical, aren't they? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Wait long enough and they'll eventually reappear, perhaps in a slightly different format, but reappear nonetheless. What will the latest iteration of thumbing a ride look like? It's anyone's guess. And here's a hint. It's not Uber. But enough of the doom and gloom. A simple gesture universally recognized. The ultimate in freedom and coolness, hitchhikers were just part of the landscape in a time when requesting a ride was done in just a few limited ways. A phone call to a friend or a relative, a call to the local taxi company, or simply walking. When you wanted to get to your destination fast, you stuck out your thumb and hoped for the best. Depending on whom you discuss this baby boomer and Generation X phenomenon with, you'll hear a range of perspectives and experiences that speak to the carefree act that enabled travel at little cost. It's probably safe to say that those who partook in the popular activity of yesteryear have fond and carefree memories of the times when merely sticking out their thumb and hoping for the best got them more than just a ride. The freedom, the adventure, the experience. All of these elements are referenced by those who hitchhiked and lived to tell the tale. Of course, it wasn't always rainbows and unicorns while trying to get to a desired destination. Sure, there were horror stories and, believe it or not, a whole genre that fed upon the idea that stranger equals danger every time, always. As Stephen Wright, the comedian, said, "I was hitchhiking the other day and a hearse stopped. I said, 'No thanks, I'm not going that far.'" But the popularity of the activity underscored the reality of what hitching a ride was about: freedom, adventure, and very little risk. As we morphed into a more insular and suspicious shell of our earlier selves, the idea of a free and trusting world where friendly strangers provided rides to random strangers seemed bizarre and frightening. After all, these were now the days of Freddy Krueger and the return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The good times morphed into a more fearful and distant society where the kindness of strangers via free rides and friendly conversation were no more. And here we sit, decades later, getting into vehicles with strangers without having to thumb a ride. No longer considered a dangerous proposition, the irony is not lost on those of us who remember the stern warnings against throwing caution to the wind and sticking out one's thumb on a very busy highway. Is it a false sense of security that we feel knowing that digital tracking may be the only barrier between life and death? Who knows? The cyclical nature of trends has proven itself real in an age of apps and impatience. When you need to get somewhere, you want to get somewhere quick. Waiting is not an option. So, into the backseat of strangers' vehicles we enter. The more things change, the more they stay the same, in a manner of speaking.